Hey, podcast listeners, Real One with you once again with Nonprofit Lowdown. Today, we're going to talk about what I consider to be a pretty interesting case study of when a Black founder leaves an organization. So, today, my guests are Cassie Haynes and Jean Friedman-Rudovsky. They are co founders of Resolve Philly, and they're in an interesting transition point. So, we're going to talk about that today. So, Jean, Cassie, welcome to the show.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
us.
All right, before we jump deep into the deep end here, Cassie, do you want to tell us a little bit about what Resolve Philly does?
Sure. I haven't done this in a couple weeks. I officially transitioned out of my role as co-executive director alongside Jean at the beginning of the month, at the beginning of June. So, for 5 years, Jean and I led Resolve Philly together. Before Resolve Philly existed, Jean was a project editor for what a lot of people thought was going to be just a real short-term experiment, like, we're going to invest a little money in some collaborative reporting in Philadelphia, and it's going to be a fun, splashy project, and then that's going to be that. And as it turns out, that's what became Resolve. Jean started off focused, facilitating a group of local news outlets in Philadelphia. Started off focused on reentry from prison as a topic. The shared approach was rooted in solutions journalism, and from there, those partners found so much value in working together that they opted to continue to work together. And at that point, Jean had really, gotten some funding around a new topic, economic mobility in Philadelphia. I was the deputy executive director of the city's anti-poverty agency. We had grown close because our children were in daycare together, and we started dreaming and scheming and planning. Jean, with her background in journalism, and at a threshold really of a lot of opportunity with this group of reporters and the newsrooms they represented, opting to continue to collaborate and share resources and work together. I was frustrated with the city of Philadelphia, and wanted to find a new way to make an impact in my community. And we did Resolve. That's how we came together. Resolve is really focused on developing and advancing journalism that's rooted in equity and collaboration, and the elevation of community voices and solutions. And so this is really centered around this collaborative reporting, and also has grown to encompass so much more,
Right.
including publication of products and consulting.
That's great. So, to get to the topic at hand, so Cassie, you are, as one of the founders of Resolve Philly, what significance does your identity as a Black woman founder bring to the organization?
I think a lot. One of the things that is not surprising, hopefully, to anybody listening, is that journalism is still relatively white and relatively dominated by men. And so my presence in a space that is still, by and large, dominated by white men, I think is important. It brought important conversations to the front. I came to the industry with a lot of ignorance, or, kind of blissful naivete about who is who and how, what decorum looked like in some of these forums that I was engaging with people in. And I think being able to question and challenge some of our partners, some of our funders, in some really specific ways, is definitely, particularly at the beginning, in establishing Resolve alongside Jean as an anti-racist organization. What does that mean? I think that's something that, I brought to the table. Jean was there for that work and those conversations, and that's something that really got baked into the fabric of the organization.
So, Jean, for you as a white woman, what was the significance for you working with Cassie and then also uplifting a lot of Black voices as the center of the work?
Yeah, I think, there is the element that Cassie just mentioned, that journalism is such a white space, white male, but, primarily just a very white space. And therefore, it felt even kind of weirder to be doing journalism, to be carrying out journalism in Philadelphia, which is a predominantly Black city, right? And so thinking about the kind of like juxtaposition there of as Cassie said, I led this reporting project around reentry. I kind of took it into its next phase of a reporting project around economic mobility and solutions to poverty in Philadelphia. But it would not have been my place, I truly believe this, to found something greater and bigger, that was focused on centering the experiences of the majority of Philadelphians and thinking about information needs of people who have been long excluded by, misrepresented by, or harmed by journalism. I could not have done that as a white woman, period, full stop, because it is not my experience. And so there could not have been an organization like the organization that we evolved into and that Cassie and I came together to found was around those guiding principles, right? How do we change journalism in the way that it happens so that it honors and provides information for, not just about, the groups that I just mentioned. And specifically in Philadelphia, that meant there needed to be Black leadership and like Black founding at the beginning. And that is what Cassie and I could do together. And so that, it particularly, I would say in the first year, was a very steep learning curve for me, in the sense that, I had, up until that point, I had been a reporter for almost my entire professional life. I had not been a leader. I had not been an entrepreneur. I had not been a manager, and I had not been in a co-leadership space with anyone else. And so being able to do that alongside Cassie, where, as Cassie sort of intimated, we had these hard conversations from the very beginning about power dynamics, not just within the industry that we were trying to change, but between the two of us and what it meant to be a Black woman and a white woman coming together to do this work. And so, I think Resolve could not have happened without the two of us working together in this way from the very beginning.
So it sounds like the conversations about race and inclusion, equity were really baked in from the beginning. And Cassie, your perspective, I know you, for personal reasons, have left the organization. So can you walk me through what are the things that you thought about from an organizational perspective before you decided to step away?
All of it, everything. I mean, it's to be honest, and I will try to talk specifically about from an organizational perspective, but also I think it's important to acknowledge that there's such a hazy boundary there, like, and not in a bad way, a way that I'm like feel very blessed to have experienced, that Jean is one of my best friends. My colleagues are people, whom I love deeply, like capital L love, and so there was the organizational perspective, and also that had to encompass how I thought about the relationships, the people, how the people were going to continue to be cared for, what that would look like. So just, kind of giving some context there, because I think in a lot of ways, emotionally, it would have been easier to just be like, all right, what does the organization need? And let's focus on that and take these, kind of deep, sometimes challenging feelings out of it. Okay, so with that said, there were the two of us. One of the things that we talked about a lot in almost every forum we could find ourselves in was the power of our shared leadership, and the impact that had on our ability to fundraise, our ability to fully support the humans carrying out the work of the organization, our ability to, show up fully, in all of these different spaces. And especially at the beginning, like two founders are better than one, fully, just fully. Three might get a little messy. I don't know. I've never been in that situation, but two is like, it is important to have that. And I think taking that away and not finding a way to, or not figuring out what the solution would be to kind of make sure that of course, the capacity for fundraising and the capacity for supporting the team, but also, the thought partnership, the diversity of perspective represented in the highest levels of decision making within the organization. And so that was, some of the earliest conversations Jean and I had were really focused on ensuring that we had the people in place to be able to withstand the kind of removal of a big chunk of a certain kind of capacity.
So that leads me into my next question. So Jean, right now you are the sole executive director of Resolve Philly. I'm curious from your perspective, how do you sort of maintain the continuity of the culture and the values that Resolve Philly was founded on when when your founder, who is a Black founder, is gone?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, I think I want to preface that by saying, because there might be some folks who are listening to this and thinking, well, why not bring in another co-executive director right now? Like, why not continue that shared leadership? Why not continue that balance? And so I want to kind of address that head on. And I think, that was when Cass first decided to leave because she moved back to Michigan to be where her mom is. And we were starting succession planning. My first instinct was, okay, so we'll hire another co-director, start kind of like thinking along that lines. And then through conversations with Cassie and other trusted folks, they questioned beyond that and said, I understand that is how you've been leading and what you would be most comfortable with. Is that best for the work right now? Is that best for your team right now? And also think about the power dynamics that would exist between another person who would be stepping into that role. It is one thing to co-lead with your co-founder. It is another thing to have a co-executive director that comes in and a co-founder who is still in that role. That is just inherently different. And so, after thought and conversations, we decided for now that I should stay sole executive director. It certainly does not rule out co-directorship in the future. And I genuinely hope that is in Resolve's future again. But I wanted to first just kind of address that straight on, because I feel like it could be a little bit of an elephant in the room in terms of this conversation. Back to your original question, I think leading off of what Cassie was mentioning about the people who work within our organization. First of all, we have an incredibly diverse staff, and I use the word diverse in the most genuine sense and meaning of that term. I'm not just talking about racial diversity. I'm talking about diversity in life experience, in professional background, in learning styles, in just so many different ways. We have amassed a team that brings that brings so much from so many different spaces and places literally around the world. And so and also, given what I said about Philadelphia and the, our population stats and how large the Black population it is also important that we have a number of Black staff on our team. So, and at all, levels, I'm talking about also diversity on, from executive team leadership, senior leadership throughout the entire organization. So one of the ways that Cassie and I, talked about shared leadership and then kind of instilled it throughout, one of the ways that Cassie and I really thought about shared leadership from the beginning was not just shared leadership between each other, but how do we have shared leadership throughout the team? Whether it's, folks sharing responsibilities for certain activities that they're carrying out or shared leadership across different programs and kind of working collaboratively together. How are we dispersing leadership and decision making amongst the organization? And so those are processes, and credit where credit is due, like mainly thanks to Cassie, that we have been working on for years. And so I think that fact made it much easier for Cassie to transition out of this role and for us to feel confident that we are still carrying out the work just as we were 6 months ago when she was sitting as co-executive director. So there's the shared leadership on the team. And then there is just the way that we do our work. So, we are what we see ourselves as the local newsroom essentially of the future, right? What local news should look like in the future down the road, because we're not quite there yet. And one of the ways that it should look like is centering community engagement and centering community voices. And so that work similarly has been ongoing for years, where it is community voices, particularly the communities I mentioned earlier, who have been long excluded or harmed by traditional media narratives, who are influencing or directing, or in some cases, even writing our coverage. And so there is a centering of those Black voices and those BIPOC voices in our actual work product. And that, that similarly has been sort of, kind of divorced from the work that Cassie, not divorced from, but that has been work that has been led by other folks on our team for a long time now. And so again, the impact of Cassie stepping out is lessened because those cycles and that work continues.
So I'm going to ask a potentially obnoxious question, but part of leadership transition is also managing perception, right? And particularly perception externally with funders. So I'm curious, Cassie or Jen, either of you can answer this, is how were you mindful about managing sort of the optics of it, particularly given the fact that the philanthropic world has started to become very sensitive about funding Black-led organizations?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think being really transparent about it, we had a relatively healthy timeline, which enabled us to have one-on-one conversations with our funders. So it wasn't like our funders were hearing about it, in a big public announcement. Jean and I have really strong relationships with the people who represent the institutions that fund us. And many of them know that my dad passed away 2 years ago. Many of them know that, my family had been planning a move and ultimately moved back to Michigan to be with my mom. And so I think, having those conversations, recognizing that when you know people as humans, when you show up to your job as a whole person and you receive other people as a whole person, it's our funders aren't concerned about what it means for Resolve Philly or for our work or for our focus on what it means to live out anti-racist values, because they know us as humans. They know our work. They know the people who are carrying out the work. We've always, as an organization, really tried to showcase the individuals on our team that are doing the thing. And so I think funders see, the larger picture, the greater scope of Resolve's leadership. And that is, one of the ways we proactively, without intending, for that to be a strategy around succession planning, that is one of the practices that we've just put in place in terms of how we do our work that really set us up for how our funders in particular, and also stakeholders that are not financial stakeholders, perceived my transition. I think it was warm. I think in a lot of ways, and that's not the case. That's not what a lot of people can say. Founders or other leadership positions when they're leaving their organization.
That's so. Oh, go ahead, Jean.
Can I add on to one thing on that? Mm-hmm. I think in large part that has been true, and also we are now in a position where there are some funding opportunities that we are not allowed to go for anymore because there is not a Black or BIPOC person sitting in the executive level seat specifically. And we can give actually two examples, and obviously without naming names, but two examples of how funders who, approach their work with an equity lens have really differed in their approach to resolve at this moment in time. So there is one funder where they, kind of written into how they were doing their work, they necessitate that there be Black leadership at the top levels of the organization, or sorry, BIPOC leadership at the top levels of the organization. So both board and executive leadership. And they made it very clear to us, we are taking this sort of to the letter of our own law. There is no longer a Black executive director, therefore you are ineligible for funding, period. It was an interesting situation because we were actually supposed to get funding from them last year, and then the proposal had to be pushed back a little bit. And so it ended up being this year, and we proactively told them, it was before Cassie stepped down, but we told them that Cassie was leaving. And so they said, therefore you're ineligible. And it prompted me to think about that last question that you asked of like, but is the work that we're proposing going to be any different? Like, will it be carried out any differently now? And the answer is probably no, because it was work that like neither Cassie nor I was working on that directly. It was led by other folks on our team. Anyway, so that is how one funder has approached things. We had another funder who we thought we would not be able to get funding from because of their, very intentional, and I should also say, excellent focus on equity. Like, let's also just say that it is awesome to be at a time where not having a Black founder could be seen as a hindrance. Like, that is, we have come very far in the world that we're even like having this conversation. And I think that it's like funders should have a focus on equity, and this is not a complaint by any means. It's more just us wanting to have a conversation about the nuances of this stuff. So this other funder who we thought we might not be eligible for came back and said to us, actually, our priority is to fund organizations with diverse and proximate leadership. And you as Resolve, leadership broadly, right? Board, senior leadership, executive leadership, you as Resolve have diverse and proximate leadership, and we would welcome an opportunity to continue talking about funding for you. So it's really interesting that there are these two, funders who kind of have the same goals and are going about it in different ways.
So one thing that you said, Jean, that was interesting is that, from the beginning, it felt important for Resolve Philly to have someone with the lived experience of being a person of color or a Black person in the leadership role. As the sole ED now, without having that lived experience, how are you thinking about making sure that it stays part of the fabric of Resolve Philly?
Yeah, I think in part it goes back to what I spoke about before of really, as much as possible. And this is something that Cassie and I started before she left, and that we meaning me and the rest of the executive team now, who I'll explain in a moment, are really pursuing very actively, is distributing power and distributing leadership. Resolve up until the beginning of June had been a very founder-led organization, right? It was Cassie and my's vision when we came together in 2018. We didn't hire our first staff folks until spring of 2019, and now we're at 22 full-time employees. And we, particularly over the last year, have worked really hard at redistributing power and decision-making throughout the organization. And I'm trying to kind of essentially double down on that process. The executive team that we have
Jean,
now.
Could I just stop you there for a second? Can you get like really specific about what those kinds of structures look like? Because I think sometimes we talk about distributed leadership, but what does that look like? What does that mean? How does it play out in real life?
Yes. So that is what I was about to get to. So in our executive team now, there's me as executive director. There's Aparna Mukherjee as our Chief Programs Officer, and there's Becca Gorelick as our Chief Operations Officer. Becca has been with us since 2019. She was one of our first hires at Operations Manager. She is someone who has, sort of come up within the organization, was recently made COO. Aparna is someone who is new. She came in from outside in December. And then me and, the position that I have more or less occupied from the beginning. And actually that trifecta is really great. Someone who's been here, someone who came up, and just this morning, Becca and I and Aparna were working on essentially a Venn diagram of our spheres of influence and our spheres of decision making. Cassie and I had our own Venn diagram essentially as co-executive directors, where there was a lot of overlap, but looking at when there are programmatic decisions that need to be made, is my voice is giving Aparna input. Aparna will be the decision maker on those things, and she will listen to my input. She will listen to input from other folks on the team. But when there's, sort of strategy program stuff, that is Aparna's lane. And I actually feel like she's way better at this point to be the person making those decisions than I am, because she is much more directly connected to the work being carried out on the day-to-day. Similarly with Becca on the operations side, there is, Becca handles finance and ops and HR. And so we've been talking through when it comes to grant prospecting and sort of going after funders. Becca is she's not in our development team. She's not seeking the funds, but us being in sort of constant conversations about the funds that we are seeking, particularly anything that is restricted, so that she can have power and weigh in and say, what, this actually is not a smart move for us right now because of X, Y, and Z. And so those decisions being made collaboratively. So I hope that answers like a little bit more sort of specifically some of that distributed, because a lot of those things that I just discussed were things that in the past, Cassie and I, we would make those decisions.
Yeah. Can I add one thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I think that's like a good example of how executive decision making is distributed. But one thing that I think is really important to point out is that as an organization, Resolve actually has codified a decision making matrix that involves all levels of the organization across all parts of the organization. And so when we're making a decision, I am continuing to say we for the purposes of this conversation, but when we're making a decision, there's, for instance, we all show up as part of the consulting work that we do with newsrooms across the country. There's a decision-making matrix that the entire staff has been trained on that lives in an accessible place that people can refer to. So when a new client or a potential client comes into the organization, everybody who has a stake in working with that client or determining whether we are working with that client has the opportunity to participate in that decision-making structure. And it's something that happens every single time. It's part of a process.
I love that so much because I find, especially with founders, not in your case, but generally with founders, everything lives in their heads. And so it's hard for them to scale or delegate or distribute authority because everything is kind of not on paper. So that's really a great tip. Cassie, let me come back to you, because as a founder, I know that the role that you play is more than just a job, right? It is so much a part of who we believe we are in the world. It's, in many ways, kind of your baby. So I'm wondering if there's advice that you can offer founders who may be listening about any lessons learned in the process of moving on from this organization that you co-founded.
Yeah, I mean, I think the right amount of time in terms of, what that transition runway looks like is clutch, and that it's not uniform. It's not, you should tell your people at this time and then public announcement at this time. And then, I think recognizing though that for your organization to be successful, time is going to be important. There are things that have to kind of unfold as they unfold. I feel like we had the right amount of time for us. I think
what was that time? Was it a year?
I mean, so it was a little less than a year from start to finish. It was July of last year when I articulated to Jean that, you know, I was thinking about maybe a couple years, 3 years, that, you know, that this was, and that, you know, this is something that, and then it was the late summer, only a couple months later, when we actually made the decision to move to Michigan. And so at that point, you know, Jean and I were in this position where I wasn't ready. I thought I needed more time with the organization. I wasn't prepared at that point to talk about leaving as soon as when I did leave the summer of 2023. In my heart, I thought I wanted, you know, at least 2 more years. And at that point, you know, that was a really, that was a tension point. That was a hard conversation. I wasn't ready to hear what Jean was sharing with me, which was the organization is not going to function the way it needs to be functioning with its co-executive director living in a different state. And that's true, you know? So I think, yes, the timeline, and whatever it is, workshopping it a little bit, being open to it changing. I had one timeline in my head, and I had to be open to my work by saying that's not a timeline that's going to work for the organization. Like, let's find something that's going to work for everybody. And, you know, it did end up being in my best interest, and what is in the organization's best interest was it aligned. Aligned.
So, oh, sorry, go ahead.
One last thing, which I think is like a mantra that Jean and I held on to for the better part of the, you know, real kind of 6 months of really working on the succession planning. And that was making the implicit explicit. There were a lot of things that, you know, that I thought were on the table or clear, or, you know, that Jean and I together thought were, you know, clear to the board, or maybe we were operating under some assumptions, or, you know, wanting to make sure that the staff was appropriately included in plans, in timelines. And so, and not wanting to assume that, you know, that people were in our brains, because they're not. And so one other piece of advice that I would give is, you know, really focusing with all of your important people. If it's a co-founder, if it's your executive leadership, it's, you know, your whole staff, your board, your funders, making the implicit explicit.
That's really good advice. And actually, that leads me into my last question before we jump into Q&A. Jean, can you talk a little bit about the role of the board in this transition? Because you spoke about the fact that you have representation at the board level, I assume. And, you know, the truth is, like, boards don't really think about succession planning until they're forced to. So what was the role of the board in thinking about making this transition in a really thoughtful way?
So the board did not engage very actively in our succession planning. Cassie and I really took the lead on that. And also, board development was a key part and continues to be a key part of our succession planning. Because Cassie and I, we have had a board, obviously, since we got our 501c3 status towards the end of 2018. The board, there was sort of that first year of just finding some folks who could be on the board. Starting in 2020 was really kind of when our board took real shape. And also, it continued to be what I've now learned as a term, what we learned as a term was a founders board. It was a group of people who were our champions, who were supporters, who wanted to show up for us and for the work, and who really deferred to Cassie and I when it came to the vision and the work and all of the things, because they respected that we were the founders and that, like, we were, you know, the stewards of the vision going forward, and they wanted to honor that. That, obviously, we recognized last year really needed to change, because not only was one founder leaving, but I really wanted to move from a place of, as I have been sort of saying, like taking off my founder's hat and really sitting more squarely in the role of executive director and not feeling like I'm carrying sort of the weight of the vision and all the things forward. So starting towards the end of last year and through this year, we've done a few different things. We've done some heavy board recruitment, so brought in some new folks, and are establishing a sort of full board development process that involves more consistent programmatic updates to the board about what is going on with just kind of the work of the organization, doing facilitating opportunities for relationship boarding amongst board members and also between board members and staff, because there hasn't been that much of that in the past either. And so it is incredibly important that the board kind of step into kind of new, I don't want to say new role, but new connection to the work of the organization.
It's new turf for the board. It's,
yes.
and it's
Yeah.
appropriate turf. It would have been hard, I think, for the board to occupy that turf before now, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's all an evolution, right? Because a founders
Totally.
board is really different than sort of a second stage board, which is really
Mhm.
different than an established institutional board, right? So it's like
Exactly.
as you grow, the board grows, the staff grows. I'm gonna welcome some Q&A. Rashid, you had a really good question. Do you want to jump in here and ask, or should I ask on your behalf?
I can jump in and ask on your behalf. I mean, on my own behalf. Sorry, y'all. Hi, Jean. Hi, Cassie.
Hey.
And y'all already actually sort of answered this a little bit earlier in the conversation, but my question was around why it's important for funders to continue like supporting this kind of work, even though, of course, they see the Black co-founder stepping away. But y'all were already speaking about it, maybe in elaboration, more so about around the staff that works there, right? And like why that's important and how we're like a part of like shared leadership.
You want to talk about that one, or should I?
Yeah, no, I can. I mean, the staff is the gosh, I'm not gonna say frontline because it's not. We don't need to repeat militaristic phrases in non-militaristic settings, but the staff are the my colleagues that do the work, that carry out, like Jean and I go get the money, and I think we have always prioritized the storytelling around our work coming from those who are carrying out the work. And so, I think more and more folks on our team are showing, and now, I mean, the pandemic threw everything off in terms of speaking engagements and conferences and whatnot. But, our folks are the ones who are showing up at conferences to talk about the work, who are, showing up in training situations to teach other people about the work. And that, because of some of the processes that we have put in place over the last year, particularly knowing that there would be a shift in leadership, in decision making, our team are also, in budget decision making roles. That's not a power, it's not an influence that we hold, and we make that really clear to our funders. And so, and our funders see it, they see it when they're at a conference and they see our director of community engagement representing the organization. They see it when they see, various other folks talking about the work that they're carrying out on behalf of the organization. And so I think we continue to seek out opportunities, development opportunities, investments to, to ensure that the larger leadership team, which is really the whole staff. I mean, it's an organization of leaders, and that is how we support people. It's how we invest in professional development. It's how we treat our interns. I think there are lots of ways, and with Hey Amani on board now, telling stories more publicly about that in ways that our funders and stakeholders can really see, I think is part of that work. It shouldn't be just Jean's face or Jean's face and Aparna's face and Becca's face, or, when people think about Resolve, when our funders think about, who Resolve is, they should think about 25 people.
So that's a beautiful, beautiful response. The other thing I'll just add here, Rashid, is I've heard folks who are transitioning out approach funders and ask them to make commitments in advance of the new executive director, the new leader stepping in, to give them a bit of a runway. And so that's something that you can consider as well. So we have a question coming in from Natoya. Natoya, do you want to jump in here and ask your question? Really excellent question. Or I can ask on your behalf.
Sure, I can ask. Hi, Jean and Cassie. So I just
Hey.
started at Resolve not too long ago. It's been a very different experience in a good way. My question is just based off of the lived experience piece that Cassie and Jean were both speaking of, because I've witnessed personally, and I think folks just see it in general, a lot of organizations that want to be racially inclusive and include the lived experiences of BIPOC staff, but it gets into a situation where they lean very heavily on those lived experiences and the ability of BIPOC staff to educate and uplift fellow staff as well as the community served. So I just wanted to know what advice either of you would have for leadership on how to maintain kind of that balance between not leaning so heavily on BIPOC staff and their lived experiences, but also creating a space where they feel free to be leaders in that area and share.
It's a great question. I have a couple thoughts, and then Cass, I would also love your thoughts on this one too. So I think a few things. One is, first of all, creating a work environment where things like that can be said very explicitly, right? Like, I think creating an environment, and I will talk about sort of how to do that, but the goal of creating an environment where, for example, if there are BIPOC folks on staff who are feeling like, you know what, it is like an emotional labor and burden that I am having to educate my white colleagues on X, Y, and Z. First of all, that they feel comfortable in saying that. And there's a lot of steps to kind of getting to a workplace where feedback can be freely given to the quote unquote higher ups. And I would say the number one rule in that is, like, if you are a leader and you want your team to be able to give good feedback, you have to understand how to receive that. And the number one thing you can do is like model that well. That's one thing. The second, I think there is, diversity among staff way too often gets reduced to numbers. And also there is a numbers question in the sense of, like, if there is just one Black person on staff, it is much more likely that they are going to feel a toll or responsibility to speak for all of the other people who come from similar experiences with them. And so I think if you are, I think it is important that there is not just sort of, that there's, safety in numbers in some way, and that there has to be kind of like a critical mass. I think it is incredibly important that, like, for example, me as a white leader, that and this has, in all honesty, this has happened at Resolve, where someone on our team who is BIPOC and who has come to me, or at this point it was me and Cassie, to say to express some discontent with how a white colleague was treating this person. I felt it really important that it should be me who has the conversation with this white colleague to call that out, and not say, and have that not be Cassie, and have it not be the person who was feeling subjected to this behavior. That, like, it was that is my work to do, like, as a white person in this world, to work with other white folks in recognizing the ways that, racism and prejudice is playing out in their own behavior, because these are things that have been instilled in us since we were born into this country that is a racist country. And so any opportunity like for fellow white leaders out there where you can take on that labor is incredibly important.
Anything to add, Cassie?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know, as a Black person who has been there in different workplaces and other workplaces, I think I felt this way as a co-founder, you know, as an executive leader, my ability to show up to my job being me, being exactly who I am, I think, and me modeling that for my colleagues, you know, so that they felt safe showing up exactly who, you know, as who they were. I do think that just undergirds what Jean brought up of being able to have these conversations openly and respectful, maybe not, you know, openly, but in appropriate ways and respectful ways, and ways that, you know, our colleagues can hear, because that's who we are. I mean, I think there is something about the highest levels of leadership practicing safety, demonstrating a safe environment, protecting at all costs, you know, the safety of the people on the team. That doesn't make that never happen, doesn't mean that, you know, BIPOC colleagues won't feel the burden, the weight of educating, of explaining, of, you know, but it does ensure that there is a safe space for that person to bring that up, so that it's not something that sits with them, so that it's something that can be addressed, and so that it's not a weight that, you know, at some other point later in time falls on another marginalized person, or person with marginalized identities or experiences.
Yeah, and I just want to say, to go back to the point that you all made about distributed leadership, I think it sounds like you've been really thoughtful about how there's representation should these things arise again. So say you're a person of color who does feel like they have to have a conversation, like there are other folks on the executive team who they can go to. I mean, Jean, obviously you, but, you know, also others. We are out of time. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us. This has been a really interesting conversation, and I really applaud you for the thoughtful and intentional way that you've thought about transitions, because it's not always the case. And Cassie, good luck to you, whatever you end up doing next. Folks, if you've enjoyed this conversation, I recommend that you go to my website, subscribe to my newsletter, and you will get information about conversations like this in your inbox every Tuesday morning. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.